Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about video games that were made in the 1960s. This may surprise some of you, but video games existed in the 1960s, and if you're at the right place at the right time, you could have actually played them. Now, the first one we're going to talk about was actually made in Poland. Now, this game was made in the year 1962, and it was called the Marienbad. Now, Marienbad was an adaptation of a game called Nim. It was called Nimrod, and it was made in 1962 by, with, by a man named Witold Podgorski in a place known as Wrocław, Poland. Now, at the city, at the place he was working at, there was a computer, and this computer was known as the Audra 1002, and he developed a game for it. Now, the game was released in 1963, and he made no attempts to advertise or spread the game. It was only available at that one facility which he had the computer at, which is where he had worked. Now, eventually, the game was remade sometime later on at the Military University of Technology in Warsaw. But besides that, the game was completely lost. Only one of the Audra 1002 computers exists, and the code is now lost. So the game will never be remade. But we know that due to the way it was programmed, it was basically unbeatable due to the way the game was built, as you went up against a robotic computer player. Due to the way it was made, you can never beat it. And again, it only exists at these two sites. The university, but initially the one computer site where she worked at in 1963. The next game we're going to be talking about was made also in 1962, but was much more well known, which was Space War. Space War was made in 1962 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for the PDP-1 computer, and it was created by a man known as Steve Russell. Now, Space War with an exclamation point was meant to simulate a space dogfight between two spaceships, one longer and more pointier, and one smaller, more triangle-like. Now, one of the main features of the game is that you could actually teleport by going to quote-unquote hyperspace. It could send you to a random position anywhere in the map, and in the middle of the map was the sun, and if you got too close to the sun, it would suck you in, and it would blow you up. Just like how the sun really does work due to its strong gravitational pull, which is why planets revolve around the solar system due to the extreme strength of the sun's gravitational power. And if you got too close, it'd suck you in and you die. And of course, the main point of the game was to try and fight your player. Now, if you didn't move, you would still move. You just kind of float around, just like how space really works. Even if your spaceship isn't actively moving, you would still float around due to how space works, being due to being no gravity. It was a very, very popular video game. Everybody loved it, and quickly began to spread to other computers at other sites as people would take the game's code and put it into other computers. Now, it was public domain. Steve Russell never made any kind of attempt to ever copyright the code, and due to the fact that there was no real market for video games at the time, this wasn't publicly feasible to make gaming publicly accessible. He didn't see a purpose in it, and so it began to spread from university to university, to computer as years went on. Now, beginning in the 1970s, they began to transfer over from the PDP computers on the microcomputers. Those began to get Space War ported on over to it, and Space War would later influence other games in the early 1970s, such as Galaxy Game and Computer Space. Galaxy Game and Computer Space both vie for the spot of the first commercial video game. Computer Space being made by Atari, which was their first game, and distributed by Netting Associates. Yeah. Anyways, coming a little bit later to 1964 with the game The Sumerian Game. The Sumerian Game was an educational game, which was meant to be a strategy game, in where you'd have to run a city in ancient Sumerian times. Now, the game was produced in part by the Board of Educational Services for Westchester County in New York State and IBM. They made computers, especially a lot back in the 1980s. Now, the first set of people to play this game were 30 sixth grade students. 2 years later, another set of students would play it. This one was a revised version with different gameplay that had been revised slightly and more audio-visual stuff added to the game alongside more narrative enhancements to it as well. Now, 3 years down the line was another game called Hammurabi. It was inspired actually by the Sumerian game, and instead of it being just generically about you having to run a city in Sumerian times, you played as Hammurabi, the man who made Hammurabi's Code, the first ever law, the first ever known law. And he's the one who created the name, the whole phrase of an eye for an eye. You take out my eye, I take out your eye. And his law was the first known law to be created. A set of rules, very rigid rules and often deadly, but no choice back then. Now, this was developed by a man known as Doug Diamond. Now, Doug Diamond developed it while he was working at the DEC, and it was developed for the recently created Focal program for Focal. Focal was made by a friend of his and had just been created. It was a sort of computer systems of type and programming type. Now, Focal this was ran on, and it was created by a man known as Richard Mermill, and it was played on the PDP-8, a successor to the PDP-1 where Space War came from. Now, eventually, Hammurabi would actually find its way to the public in the early 1970s, being put onto 101 basic games. Now, the final game we're going to talk about. Now, another game developed in 1969. The following year was a game called Lunar Lander. Now, Lunar Lander was originally a text-based game, which means it was entirely printed out on the paper, due to the way it was back then. And it was developed by a man known as Jim Storer while he was actually in high school. And over the years, many people would recreate Lunar Lander for various computer systems throughout the 1970s. Over the years of upgrading from being paper and being purely text-based, like the original version, which was purely text-based, to a digital screen version. And the digital screen version would eventually be made into an arcade game in 1979 for Atari, Lunar Lander. By the time that game was already out, there was already various Lunar Lander-based games, and it had become a type of game, not just one game, a type of game, a Lunar Lander type game. And it all started with the original 1969 text-based version. The last game we're going to talk about is Space Travel, also made in 1969. It was a 2D representation of the solar system, and had you traveling throughout the solar system as you tended to land on various planets and such. And is a fairly basic game, as it was developed by a man known as Ken Thompson. Ken Thompson made the game, and it's very basic. You just travel through the solar system and try and land on planets. But these games were all invented in the 1960s, and if you're at the right place at the right time, you could have played them. Now, you could not have played all of them. You could have played most of them, but you probably could never have played Murrumbad. Or you could have played Murrumbad, but you could never have played any of these. How it is. Anyways, tomorrow we're going to talk about video games made in the 1950s. So I'll see you all around. Well, bye. Have a nice time.